The studio lights were too bright. They always were. But on this particular afternoon in 1977, they felt different. Harsher, more unforgiving, like they were designed to expose rather than illuminate. Gary Crosby sat in the interview chair, his face a careful mask. He was 43 years old, a former child actor, a man who had spent his entire life in the shadow of one of the most beloved voices in American history. His father had been dead for exactly 11 days. The interviewer across from him was doing what interviewers did in those situations, offering condolences, speaking in hushed tones about legacy and loss, asking the expected questions about memories and grief. The whole thing had the choreographed feel of a ritual everyone knew by heart. This was how these conversations went. Someone famous died, the family appeared, everyone said nice things, and America moved on, its illusions intact. But Gary Crosby had not come to follow the script. He had come to burn it down. What happened in that studio over the next several minutes would do more than shock the entertainment industry. It would crack open a conversation about fame, family, and the price children pay when their parents belong to the world. It would make people question every smile they had ever seen in a publicity photo, every perfect family portrait that had ever graced a magazine cover. And it would ensure that Bing Crosby, the man with the velvet voice, the casual crooner who had soundtracked American Christmases for generations, would never be remembered the same way again. But before we understand what Gary said, we need to understand who Bing Crosby was. Not the real man. That was precisely the problem, but the idea of him, the myth that had been carefully constructed over decades of film, radio, and records. Bing Crosby was not just a singer. He was an institution. By the time of his death in October 1977, he had sold over 500 million records. He had starred in over 70 films. His recording of White Christmas was the best-selling single of all time, a record it would hold for decades. When Americans thought of Christmas, they heard his voice. When they thought of easy, effortless cool, they pictured him. The pipe, the hat, the way he could make the hardest notes sound like he was just thinking them rather than singing them. And crucially, when they thought of Bing Crosby, they thought of family. This was a man who had appeared in countless films playing priests, fathers, and kindly father figures. His movie roles often featured him as a gentle patriarch, wise and patient, solving problems with a song and a smile. His public image was one of domestic contentment, a man who had found the perfect balance between stardom and home life, who could conquer Hollywood and still be there for Sunday dinner. The Crosby household was presented to America as a kind of ideal. Bing and his first wife Dixie Lee had 4 sons, Gary, twins Dennis and Philip, and Lindsay. Photos of the family appeared regularly in magazines. The boys were handsome, talented, seemingly well-adjusted. They occasionally appeared in their father's films or recordings. To the public, they looked like the luckiest children in America, growing up with wealth, opportunity, and a father who was not just famous but beloved. The reality, as Gary would reveal, was something else entirely. Gary Crosby had been living with this reality his entire life. He had been born into it in 1933, when his father was already a major star. He had grown up in it through the 1940s and 1950s, as Bing's fame only grew. He had tried to build his own career around it, appearing in films and television, always carrying his father's name, never quite escaping the comparison. And he had watched, year after year, as the world celebrated a man he knew in ways they never could. The thing about family secrets is that they require cooperation. They survive because everyone agrees, implicitly or explicitly, not to tell. And in Hollywood, where image was everything and scandal could end careers, that cooperation was often compulsory. You protected the brand. You maintained the illusion. You said the right things in interviews, smiled in the right photos, and kept the darkness behind closed doors where it belonged. Gary had done this. For decades, he had done this. He had played the role of the dutiful son, the grateful child of a legend. He had given interviews where he praised his father's work ethic, his talent, his generosity. He had, by all appearances, followed the script, but his father was dead now. The man was gone. Only the legend remained. And Gary Crosby had decided he was done protecting it. The interview started conventionally enough. The host expressed sympathy. Gary accepted it with the expected grace. They talked about the funeral, which had been held just days before at St. Paul the Apostle Catholic Church in Los Angeles. It had been a massive affair, attended by Hollywood royalty, politicians, and fans. The tributes had been glowing. The eulogies had emphasized Bing's kindness, his faith, his contributions to American culture. It had been, in every way, the funeral of a beloved icon. Gary had stood there through all of it. He had remained silent. He had played his part one last time. But now in this studio with the cameras rolling, someone asked him what it had been like, growing up as Bing Crosby's son. And Gary Crosby stopped playing his part. The words that came out were measured at first, careful. He talked about pressure, about expectations, about the difficulty of having a famous father. This was all relatively safe territory. Child actors and celebrity children often spoke about these challenges. It was understood that growing up in the spotlight came with unique difficulties. But then Gary went further. He began to describe a household ruled by fear. He talked about a father who was distant, cold, impossible to please. He spoke about punishments that went beyond discipline, about a man who demanded perfection and reacted to anything less with rage. The studio did go quiet. You could feel the shift in energy, the way everyone present suddenly understood that this was not going to be a typical memorial interview. This was something else. This was a reckoning. Gary described beatings, not spankings, not the kind of corporal punishment that was common in that era and might be dismissed as simply being of its time. He described violence. He talked about being hit with belts, with fists, about punishments that left bruises, about a household where the children lived in constant fear of their father's temper. He described a man who was beloved by millions, but who seemed to have little love for his own children. A man who saved his warmth for his public, his performances, his fans, and had nothing left when he came home. A man who saw his children not as people to be nurtured, but as possessions to be controlled, projects to be perfected, disappointments to be punished. The interviewer, to their credit, did not interrupt, did not try to soften the testimony, did not rush to defend the legend. They simply let Gary speak. And Gary kept speaking. He talked about the drinking, both his father's and his mother's. Dixie Lee had been an alcoholic, a fact that had been carefully hidden from the public during her lifetime. She had died in 1952 when Gary was just 19. He had watched her destruction, watched his father's neglect contribute to it, watched the whole family system corrode from within while maintaining its shiny exterior for the world. He talked about the pressure to perform, to be perfect, to never embarrass the Crosby name, about how that pressure had shaped all four brothers, had left them all damaged in different ways, about how success was never enough, how approval was always withheld, how they had been raised by a man who seemed to view fatherhood as another role to play for the cameras rather than a relationship to actually live. What made Gary's testimony so devastating was not just what he was saying, though the content was shocking enough. It was the way he was saying it. There was no hysteria, no obvious anger. He spoke with the flat affect of someone who had lived with these truths for so long that they had become simply facts, data points in the story of his life. He was not trying to destroy his father's reputation out of spite. He was simply, finally, telling the truth about what that household had been like, about what the cost of Bing Crosby's perfection had been for the children who had to live with the imperfect man behind it. The interview aired, and America reacted with shock. It is difficult now, decades later, to fully convey how radical this moment was. We live in an age where celebrity memoirs routinely expose family dysfunction, where tell-all interviews are common, where the gap between public image and private reality is widely understood and constantly discussed. But in 1977, this kind of public revelation was rare, especially about someone who had just died, especially about someone as beloved as Bing Crosby. The immediate response was mixed. Some people believed Gary, some defended Bing, suggesting that Gary was exaggerating, seeking attention, trying to profit from his father's death. Some fell back on the era's standards. Corporal punishment was normal then, they said. Children were expected to be disciplined. Gary was being too sensitive by modern standards. But others began to speak up. People who had worked Bing came forward cautiously to suggest that yes, he had been difficult, demanding, sometimes cruel. Other Hollywood children began to share their own stories, emboldened by Gary's willingness to break the silence. The narrative began to shift, and people started listening to White Christmas differently. That song, which had been released in 1942 and had become synonymous with the holiday season, suddenly felt complicated. The warm, gentle voice singing about dreaming of a white Christmas, about memories of childhood and home, now carried different weight when you knew what kind of home Bing Crosby's own children had experienced. The gap between the sentiment of the song and the reality of the singer's household created a kind of cognitive dissonance that was impossible to ignore once you were aware of it. This was not the first time someone had suggested that a beloved public figure might be different in private, but it might have been one of the first times that revelation came directly from a child, in such a public forum so soon after the parent's death, and with such specific, damning details. Gary's brothers had mixed reactions to his decision to speak out. Dennis, one of the twins, would later support Gary's account and add his own stories of abuse. Philip was more circumspect, but did not contradict the essential facts. Lindsay, the youngest, struggled the most with the revelation and its aftermath. The family had already been fractured by their childhood. This public exposure of that fracture only made the divisions deeper. What Gary's interview did, intentionally or not, was open a door. It began a conversation about the children of the famous, about the performance of family that Hollywood required, about the price of maintaining illusions. It made people ask harder questions about the stars they admired. If Bing Crosby, kind, gentle Bing Crosby, could be an abusive father, then what else might be hidden behind other carefully cultivated images? The interview also revealed something about the nature of legacy and control. Bing Crosby had spent his entire career carefully managing his image. He had been media savvy before that term existed, understanding instinctively how to present himself in ways that would maximize his appeal. He had built an empire on that image, the relaxed, easygoing, family-friendly crooner. He had made millions of dollars from it. He had shaped how generations of Americans thought about music, about entertainment, about family itself. But he could not control what happened after he died. He could not silence his son. He could not suppress the truth that Gary carried. All the careful image management in the world could not survive the testimony of someone who had actually been there, who had lived the reality behind the illusion. Gary Crosby would continue to speak about his childhood in the years that followed. In 1983, he published a memoir called Going My Own Way, a pointed reference to his father's Oscar-winning film Going My Way, in which Bing played a kind, understanding priest. The book went into even greater detail about the abuse, about the family dysfunction, about the vast distance between Bing Crosby the public figure and Bing Crosby the father. The book was controversial. Some reviewers praised Gary's courage in speaking his truth. Others accused him of exploiting his father's fame, of cashing in on family tragedy, of being unable to move on. Bing's widow, Catherine, and his 3 children from his second marriage disputed the characterization, saying their experience of Bing as a father had been entirely different, that he had changed, that the man Gary described was not the man they knew. And this was likely true. Bing had remarried in 1957 to a woman named Catherine Grant, nearly 30 years his junior. They had 3 children together, Harry, Mary, and Nathaniel. By all accounts, Bing was a different father to these children. Older, perhaps wiser, certainly more mellowed. The contrast between his 2 sets of children would become another part of the story, the idea that Bing had learned from his failures with his first family, that he had become capable of the warmth and affection he had withheld from Gary and his brothers. But that knowledge offered no comfort to Gary and his brothers. If anything, it might have made things worse. The confirmation that their father had been capable of being better, that he had simply chosen not to be, or had learned too late, or had cared more about getting it right the second time than about repairing the damage from the first. The tragedy of the Crosby sons did not end with revelation. Dennis Crosby died by suicide in 1991. Lindsay Crosby died by suicide in 1989. Both deaths were linked by those who knew them to the trauma of their childhood, to the long shadow their father had cast over their lives. Philip died of a heart attack in 2004. Gary himself died in 1995 from lung cancer. None of them outlived the damage they had described. Speaking the truth, breaking the silence, had not saved them. It had simply ensured that the truth was known. In the decades since Gary's interview, the revelation about Bing Crosby's abuse has become part of his legacy, impossible to separate from his artistic achievements. Biographies of Bing now routinely discuss both the public triumphs and the private failures. Articles about his music often include acknowledgement of his complicated family life. He is remembered as both a towering talent and a deeply flawed man, which is perhaps closer to the truth than the one-dimensional image he had worked so hard to cultivate. But the impact of Gary's decision to speak extends beyond just Bing Crosby's reputation. It contributed to a broader cultural shift in how we think about famous families, about the cost of fame, about the children who are born into spotlights they never chose. Gary's testimony helped pave the way for other celebrity children to speak their truths. It established a template for how those conversations could happen, how the silence could be broken. It demonstrated that loyalty to family did not have to mean complicity in covering up abuse, that love for a parent could coexist with honesty about who that parent had been. It also raised uncomfortable questions about complicity and knowledge. How many people in Hollywood had known about Bing's treatment of his children? How many had stayed silent to protect the brand, the image, the money that depended on that image? How many had prioritized the comfort of illusion over the welfare of actual children? These were questions without easy answers, and they remain relevant today, every time a beloved figure is revealed to have been something else in private. Every time we are forced to reconcile the art with the artist, the public good with the private harm. The moment Gary Crosby really spoke in that interview was the moment the illusion shattered. The perfect father image that Bing had cultivated, that Hollywood had helped him maintain, that the public had wanted to believe in, could not survive the weight of truth spoken by someone who had actually been there. It was the moment when one man decided that his father's reputation was less important than his own truth. That the world's comfort with its illusions was less important than speaking the reality that he and his brothers had lived. There is something both brave and heartbreaking about that decision. Brave because it took tremendous courage to speak against such a beloved figure, to know that he would be disbelieved, criticized, attacked for telling a story that people did not want to hear. Heartbreaking because the very fact that such courage was necessary reveals how much had been wrong, how deep the silence had run, how completely the truth had been suppressed. In the studio that day, when Gary Crosby spoke, he was not just talking about his father. He was talking about every perfect image that conceals abuse, every smile that hides pain, every public triumph built on private tragedy, every child expected to keep silent for the sake of a parent's reputation. He was saying, I was there. I know what it was really like, and I am going to tell you whether you want to hear it or not. The interview ended. The lights stayed harsh. Gary walked out of that studio having done something irreversible. He had taken the truth that had been locked inside that family for decades, and he had given it to the world. There was no taking it back, no smoothing it over, no returning to the comfortable illusion. From that moment forward, Bing Crosby would be two men in the public consciousness: the voice of Christmas, the consummate entertainer, the icon of mid-century American culture, and the father who failed, who hurt his children, who maintained a perfect image while presiding over a troubled home. Both things were true. That was the revelation. That was what Gary forced America to confront, that the same person could be both, that talent and achievement did not preclude cruelty, that the world could love someone who caused tremendous private harm, that legacy was complicated, that truth mattered, that children deserved to have their experiences acknowledged even when those experiences contradicted what the world wanted to believe. The consequences rippled outward. Conversations changed. Assumptions were questioned. Other stories began to be told. The idea that fame and talent and public goodness guaranteed private virtue began to erode, slowly at first, then more rapidly as more people found the courage to speak, inspired by Gary's example. We are still living with those consequences, still having those conversations, still learning how to hold space for both the art and the artist, the achievement and the harm, the public legacy and the private truth. Gary Crosby gave an interview in 1977. His father had been dead for 11 days. The studio was too bright. The questions were predictable. And then one man decided to answer them honestly. That was the moment. The moment when the silence broke, when the perfect father image crumbled, when one son decided that truth mattered more than legend. The world was listening, and it would never listen to White Christmas quite the same way again. The legacy of that moment is complex. It did not erase Bing Crosby's contributions to music and film. His recordings still play, his movies still exist, his influence on American popular culture remains significant, but it added context. It added truth. It added the voices of the children who had been silenced for so long. And it reminded us all that behind every perfect image, there are real people living real lives. And sometimes those lives are very different from what the image suggests. That we have a responsibility to listen when those people speak, even when, especially when, what they tell us contradicts what we want to believe. Gary Crosby sat in that chair. The lights were too bright. He had spent his whole life in the shadow of his father's fame, and for a few crucial minutes, he stepped into the light and told the truth. That moment mattered. It still matters. It will continue to matter as long as we care about truth, about children, about the distance between image and reality. The studio went quiet. Then Gary spoke, and nothing was ever quite the same again.